A rare August storm. That's not a typo, and it's not an exaggeration for a thumbnail. That is a real on Tuesday. A wall of wind and rain tore across the Midwest with a violence that most people in its path had genuinely never experienced before. Not because it was unprecedented in the historical record, but because the specific kind of storm behind it, a derecho, is rare enough that entire cities can go years without seeing one. Chicago hadn't seen a derecho in 6 years. When this one hit, it brought hurricane-force wind gusts, confirmed tornadoes, and knocked out power to hundreds of thousands of people across half a dozen states in a matter of hours. And here's the part that makes this a story you still need to hear right now, not just a recap of what already happened. The same broad, slow-moving weather system responsible for that derecho hasn't finished with the region. Rounds of heavy rain and flash flooding are continuing to threaten the Ohio Valley and central Appalachians as this pattern grinds on. I want to walk you through exactly what a derecho actually is, why this one earned the label rare from meteorologists instead of just severe, and what's still coming for the areas in this system's path over the next several days. Stick with me to the end, because I'll also explain the specific ingredient that turned an ordinary line of August thunderstorms into one of the most destructive wind events this region has seen in years. And if you want to be here for the next update as this pattern continues, subscribe to Nymora Proof before we get into it. Let's go! Let me start with exactly what happened, because the scale of this event deserves to be laid out plainly before we get into the mechanics of it. On Tuesday, August 11th, a powerful squall line slammed through the Chicago metro area, delivering the city's first derecho in 6 years. Hurricane-force wind gusts tore through the region alongside drenching downpours. At least 3 tornadoes were confirmed by the National Weather Service before the night was over. That includes one along the southern Cook and Will County border, and 2 others in eastern and northeastern Will County. But this wasn't a Chicago-only event. The same system swept onward from Iowa through Indiana and into Ohio, continuing to intensify as it went. In Gary, Indiana, a wind gust of 99 miles per hour was recorded at the Gary-Chicago International Airport. That's a number that genuinely rivals hurricane-force winds, despite this being an entirely different kind of storm system altogether, over 1,000 miles from any ocean. In central Ohio, winds reached as high as 82 miles per hour, strong enough to flip a car on the highway. And in northwest Indiana, 1 person tragically died when a house exploded during the storm, a blast still under investigation. Neighbors reported it happened right as people stepped outside to check the damage that had already occurred. By the time the worst of it had passed, this derecho had claimed at least 3 lives. It left more than 700,000 people across the Midwest without power. Indiana alone reported over 300,000 customers in the dark after violent winds took down power poles across the state. Utility crews described the restoration effort as a multi-day process in some of the hardest-hit communities. That tells you something important about the scale of physical damage this storm actually caused to the region's infrastructure, not just the immediate inconvenience of losing electricity for an afternoon. So let's actually define what happened here, because derecho isn't just a dramatic word meteorologists reach for to describe any bad storm. It's a specific, technical classification. Understanding the definition tells you exactly why this event earned the label rare. To officially qualify as a derecho, a line of thunderstorms has to produce a continuous or intermittent swath of wind damage, stretching at least 250 miles long and at least 60 miles wide. It needs wind gusts reaching at least 58 miles per hour along most of that path. And it needs several well-separated gusts of 75 miles per hour or greater somewhere within it. That's a genuinely demanding set of criteria. It's precisely why derechos don't happen every time a line of severe thunderstorms rolls through. This particular system met and exceeded every part of that threshold, with gusts well above the minimum requirement recorded in multiple states along its track. The damage stretched across a corridor that ultimately touched Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and reached into parts of West Virginia and Virginia as well. Here's why derechos, despite being wind events rather than tornadoes, are genuinely one of the more underappreciated dangers in American severe weather. A tornado, even a strong one, typically affects a relatively narrow path, sometimes just a few hundred yards wide, even though the damage within that path can be catastrophic. A derecho spreads damaging, often destructive, straight-line winds across an enormous continuous swath of territory. It can potentially affect multiple states in a single, sustained event lasting many hours as the line of storms races forward, sometimes at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour itself. That combination of speed and breadth is exactly what allowed this storm to affect so many communities across so many states within a single day. It's why the cumulative damage and power outage numbers from a derecho can end up rivaling or exceeding what a single strong tornado produces, just distributed across a vastly larger footprint. Now let's talk about the mechanism, because understanding why this specific pattern produced a derecho, rather than just an ordinary line of summer thunderstorms, explains why meteorologists were using the word rare well before the storm even arrived. Derechos require a very specific combination of atmospheric ingredients to organize and sustain themselves over hundreds of miles. You need a substantial reservoir of instability, essentially fuel in the atmosphere for thunderstorms to feed on. This particular event was riding on top of the same oppressive summer heat and humidity that had been building across the region for days beforehand. You also need strong wind shear loft, the change in wind speed and direction with height. That shear allows a line of storms to organize and tilt in a way that keeps feeding new energy into its leading edge rather than collapsing under its own rain-cooled outflow the way an ordinary thunderstorm eventually does. And critically, for a derecho specifically, you need a mechanism that allows the storm's own outflow, the pool of cold, dense air it generates at the surface, as rain evaporates and cools the air beneath the storm, to actually accelerate and sustain the line's forward motion. That's rather than simply spreading out and weakening it. When all of those ingredients line up simultaneously across a broad enough geographic area, you get exactly the kind of self-sustaining, fast-moving, long-lived line of destructive wind that swept from the Midwest into the Ohio Valley this week. I want to give you the historical context too, because it's genuinely part of why the storm generated so much attention. Derechos aren't unheard of in August, but they're also not a routine expected feature of the month, the way ordinary afternoon thunderstorms are. The National Weather Service office covering the Chicago area has documented severe weather events going back years. This was the first derecho recorded for that specific region since a previous one back in 2020, a genuine 6-year gap for an event of this classification and scale. That's the honest basis for the word rare attached to this storm. Not exaggeration for a headline. It's a real reflection of how infrequently this exact combination of atmospheric ingredients comes together with enough intensity to produce a storm meeting the full technical definition. Now here's the part of this story that I think deserves the most attention right now, because the derecho itself, as destructive as it was, isn't actually the end of this pattern. The same broad weather system responsible for Tuesday's derecho has continued producing rounds of heavy rain across the same general corridor in the days since. The flooding threat tied to it has, if anything, become the more serious ongoing concern. A slow-moving front interacting with unusually moist, almost tropical-feeling air has been driving repeated waves of intense rainfall. Rates of 1 to 3 inches per hour are possible in the most intense downpours. That combination, a front that refuses to move quickly, paired with an atmosphere loaded with tropical-level moisture, is exactly the recipe for the kind of flooding that doesn't come from any single dramatic storm. Instead, it comes from the same areas getting hit again and again in a short window of time. The numbers coming out of this flooding threat are genuinely striking. In one community, a rare flash flood emergency, the highest level of flash flood warning issued by the National Weather Service, was declared after roughly a month's worth of rain fell in just 3 hours. That's not a typo or an exaggeration for effect. That's the literal measured rainfall total, delivered in a window of time so short that drainage systems, streams, and rivers across the affected area had no realistic chance of keeping pace with it. In Confluence, Pennsylvania, 10 people had to be rescued from a flooded home. Another person was pulled from the roof of a vehicle after the area saw 3 to 5 inches of rain in just a few hours. In Perry County, Ohio, vehicles were left fully submerged in floodwater. Multiple roads were closed due to high water. Swift water rescue teams from adjacent counties had to be deployed to assist with ongoing rescue operations. As of the most recent guidance, a level 3 of 4 threat of flooding rainfall remains in place across a stretch of territory that includes Charleston, West Virginia, Cincinnati, and Columbus, Ohio, and the eastern portions of Indianapolis. Flash flooding remains possible in a corridor stretching all the way from Chicago through Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The most serious ongoing threat is concentrated specifically in the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians. That's the part of this story that's genuinely still unfolding as you're watching this video, not a recap of Tuesday's derecho. It's an active, continuing threat layered directly on top of ground that's already saturated, an infrastructure that, in many communities, is still without power from the initial storm. Let me walk you through why this combination, wind damage followed immediately by repeated flooding, is such a genuinely difficult scenario for emergency responders and residents alike to manage. A derecho's damage is immediate and visible. Downed trees, damaged homes, power lines on the ground. That damage gets assessed and recovery work begins almost right away. But when the same broad weather pattern that produced the wind event continues to deliver repeated rounds of heavy rain on top of an area still recovering, you get compounding hazards. Downed trees and debris can block drainage and worsen localized flooding. Crews trying to restore power have to navigate flooded roads to reach damaged lines. And residents who spent Tuesday dealing with wind damage and power loss are, in some of the same communities, now also contending with rising water. Sometimes that comes with very little warning, given how quickly these flash flood emergencies have been developing in windows as short as 3 hours from the start of heavy rain to catastrophic flooding. So here's what actually matters going forward, and this is the part I promised you at the top, what to expect from here. For the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians specifically, including the corridor from Charleston through Cincinnati, Columbus, and into eastern Indianapolis, treat the flooding threat as the primary ongoing danger through the next several days, not a footnote to Tuesday's Derecho. Continued rounds of heavy rain falling on already saturated ground mean that flash flooding can develop rapidly, sometimes with only a few hours of warning. The historical pattern from this exact system, a month's worth of rain in 3 hours in at least one community already, shows just how quickly conditions can escalate from routine rain to a genuine flash flood emergency. If you're anywhere in that corridor, know that the oldest rule in flood safety still applies without exception. Never drive into a flooded road, regardless of how familiar the route looks or how shallow the water appears. It takes a shockingly small amount of moving water to sweep a vehicle away. For communities still without power in the wake of Tuesday's Derecho, particularly across Indiana and the broader Midwest corridor the storm tracked through, expect restoration to remain a genuinely multi-day effort in the hardest hit areas, according to utility companies managing the recovery. That's worth planning around directly, whether that means securing a generator, checking on elderly neighbors who may be more vulnerable to extended power loss and continued summer heat, or simply setting realistic expectations rather than assuming power will be back by the next morning. And more broadly, for anyone across the wider Midwest and Ohio Valley region, this event is a genuinely useful reminder that rare doesn't mean impossible or not worth preparing for. A derecho of this scale and destructiveness can develop with only a day or two of real lead time once the specific atmospheric ingredients align. That's exactly why staying connected to official weather alerts through the full life cycle of an active weather pattern, not just checking once and assuming the danger is past after the initial storm moves through, remains the single most effective thing anyone in this region can do heading into the rest of the week. I want to close with the honest uncertainty here too, because that's the responsible way to end a story about a pattern that's still actively unfolding, rather than one that's already concluded. Exactly how much additional rainfall falls in the hardest hit communities, and exactly how quickly power restoration proceeds across the affected states, both remain genuinely fluid situations that are changing by the day as the system continues to move through the region. What's not uncertain is the pattern itself, a rare, historically significant derecho, followed by a continuing, serious flooding threat riding on the same broad weather system. That's hitting communities that in some cases are dealing with both hazards literally at the same time. Before you go, I want to ask you something, because I think this event captures something genuinely important about how differently people experience the same storm system depending on exactly where they live within its path. If you're in the Midwest or Ohio Valley right now, are you dealing more with the aftermath of Tuesday's wind damage, the ongoing flooding threat, or honestly both at once? Drop a comment and tell me, because I think understanding how compounding disasters like this one actually play out on the ground, not just in the forecast language, is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost in a headline but matters enormously to the people actually living through it. If this gave you a clearer, more complete picture of what's actually happening and what's still coming, hit that like button. It genuinely helps careful, detailed breakdowns like this one reach the people who need it while this pattern is still actively unfolding. Subscribe to Nymora Proof so you're here for the next update as the flooding threat continues to evolve across the Ohio Valley and Appalachians. Because I'll be tracking it closely over the next several days. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.